Hi there, I'm Jack Daley,
Hi, I'm Gavin Rees.
and we're presenting live from the Winthrop House B002 Seminar Room. Yep.
All right. So we're presenting on Port Hambantota in Sri Lanka. And we thought this was a good case study for how domestic politics can really cripple a international development project and lead to a lot of community unrest, all kind of in this large geopolitical setting.
Sweet, so to give a brief roadmap for our presentation, we're going to start by giving a background on the country of Sri Lanka and the Hambantota region. And then we're going to give an overview of the Port Hambantota development. And then we're going to dive into the analysis of the political factors contributing to the failure, and then the larger significance of the failure. And then to conclude, we're going to talk about the legacy of the Port Hambantota failure, what Port Hambantota could look like in the future, and lessons for EWB at the small scale.
Yeah, so just in case you guys don't know where Sri Lanka is.
Right there.
Right there. And just a little bit of a background on Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka gained independence from Britain in 1948. So it's a post-colonial country, population of 21 million, lower middle income country in the World Bank scale. So if you're not familiar, the World Bank scale goes low income, middle income, high income. So they are in the lower section of the middle income. And the main location of interest, of course, is Hambantota in the south of Sri Lanka. And then we also have Colombo, which is in the southwest. Colombo is the capital of Sri Lanka and is home to Sri Lanka's largest port currently. A little bit of background on Hambantota specifically. So Hambantota is pretty economically underdeveloped and pretty sparsely populated. 600,000 residents, most of which, the vast majority of which are classified as rural, and pretty high unemployment rate. Just to give you a sense of kind of the economic factors at play there, it's about a little bit less than half the national unemployment. So just specifically a little bit more about the economic context. So Colombo and Hambantota are situated on the south of Sri Lanka, and that's pretty well situated to capture a lot of the transshipment traffic going through the Indian Ocean. So you can imagine this large shipping lane here coming in from the Suez Canal, swinging around the tip of India and Sri Lanka and heading over to Malaysia. So Colombo is a really well-developed port. As of 2016, it's the busiest transshipment container port in South Asia and the 13th worldwide. Just to give you a little bit of a comparison, that's busier than the Panama Canal before the 2016 locks installment. So that is one of the reasons why thinking about a port here was really kind of an interesting economic idea.
Sweet. Yeah, so given these favorable economic and shipping conditions, Sri Lanka had been interested in developing a port in Hambantota for quite a while. This would just be a major port for cargo processing and ship servicing, and the rationale was to spur development in a very rural region, and also reduce reliance on the Port of Colombo, which was pretty much the country's only major port. So a few parties to think about that we'll be talking about in future slides are the Sri Lanka Port Authority, and then President Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was the president of Sri Lanka from the early 2000s up to 2014, and he was really the driving force behind the Hambantota port. And with the original plan, the port was going to be divided into 3 phases. The first phase, to be begun in 2003, would establish a port for non-containerized cargo. I won't get into too much of the shipping details, but basically it was just an initial step for the port. And then phase 2 was meant to expand the port, expand container handling, and then phase 3 would provide further additions to the port and then also include some real estate development in the land surrounding the port. So a very ambitious project, but began in 2003 under President Mahinda Rajapaksa.
Yeah, so just a little bit of like the concrete details on how it was implemented. So as Jack said, it began in 2003. Phase 1 cost $360 million, most of which was Chinese loans and was actually contracted out to 2 Chinese companies. Was successfully completed in 2010, and it provided some kind of transshipment facilities. So your ship repair, ship construction, crew change facilities, and everything. And then phase 2 began in 2010, financed by Chinese loans once again, and adding berths to the port for the dredging, breakwater, stuff like that. And it was during the phase 2 that there was a forced project ownership change. So because after phase 1, the port was just not very profitable at all, the Sri Lankan government was unable to pay a large amount of its debt that it had to China. And this was partially due to going ahead with phase 2, even though phase 1 really wasn't very successful in terms of profitability. So the Sri Lankan government incurred over $1 billion in debt with a high interest rate. And that interest rate was across both phases. So the $360 million initially, as well as the later funding. And Sri Lanka tried to put in some policies that would help Hambantota get a little bit more traffic, such as requiring all cars to be shipped through Hambantota. But that, though it increased the traffic, really didn't alleviate the overall problem. So due to the debt, Sri Lanka leased 80% of the port ownership to a company in China, China Merchant Port Holdings Company, for 99 years. So essentially just giving up the port for the foreseeable future. And if you look on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, China Merchant Port Holdings Company is publicly listed, but a majority of those shares are held by China Merchants Group, which is a state-owned corporation. So essentially, the state of China bought the Hambantota port.
Great. So there are a number of immediate effects to the Port Hambantota project. The first being that it performed very poorly economically. There were only 300 ship visits in 2018, so less than one per day, and this was compared to government projections of 2,500 a year. And so they were way off from being a profitable port, just an order of magnitude off. And this put Sri Lanka in a lot of debt. And so in order to erase that debt, they ended up entering into a deal with China that exchanged a lot of the debt for equity, as Gavin said. And so China basically was the majority owner of the port, and part of this deal also leased 15,000 acres of land in the area. So China became the dominant geopolitical force in the Hambantota region. And this led to a lot of community tension and civil unrest. There were a lot of local populations that were displaced, a lot of populations that were concerned about the potential effects that China could have on their land, even though they hadn't yet developed in the area. And so we'll talk about some of the political repercussions later, but it was a very big issue politically. And this quote really highlights the mood at the time in the region. This is from a district politician in Hambantota. "We are against leasing the lands where people live and do their farming, while there are identified lands for an industrial zone. When you give away such a vast area of land, you can't stop the area becoming a Chinese colony." So it definitely shows the worry among local Sri Lankans at the time with regards to this deal with China.
So now we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at what exactly went wrong in the Hambantota project. So there were some early red flags. So internationally, it wasn't really viewed as a good idea from the beginning. There were a couple feasibility studies that all came back negative. And the idea really wasn't very recent. It had been around for a fair amount of time, but it was Rajapaksa's government was the first to actually consider it. And they didn't really take in much local input from the Hambantota area. So they just kind of went ahead with this project despite these feasibility studies and without really much on the ground analysis. So China was the only party willing to finance it. India turned them down, partially due to the really negative outlook, which had in some aspects to do with the fact that Colombo had room for expansion. So there's really no reason to go about building a new port in Hambantota when you could just add those facilities to Colombo. And Colombo already had a foothold in the region, kind of in like the general transshipment in the Indian Ocean. So there was, little incentive for ships to stop in Hambantota as opposed to Colombo. So one of the reasons this actually went forward was because of some political interests. So Hambantota was the hometown of President Rajapaksa, and so that clearly gave him an incentive to push the project forward so he could serve his base constituency. And the large-scale development projects, which he had a history of doing outside of Hambantota, made him seem like this powerful visionary, which really helped him politically in the national theater. And though this is not confirmed by China, there were some talks of military and intelligence operations by China in the Hambantota port, which could give some more political motives for the construction of the port and the eventual leasing. Yeah, so just to give you a little bit more context on the region. So this is a graph of essentially the traffic at the Port of Colombo. So you can see well before Hambantota construction starts, Port of Colombo is doing well, it is growing, and after Hambantota construction starts, it continues to grow. So there was really no indicator that Colombo was going to fail or there would need to be some sort of replacement. And just to make that comparison a little bit more clear, this is a graph of Colombo's port calls in 2016-2017 versus Hambantota's. So Colombo is that spiky green line. Hambantota is the line just kind of like wiggling around the axis on the bottom there. So as you can see, Hambantota is really not getting as much traffic as Colombo and is really quite empty.
So as we were thinking about all that went wrong with this project, clearly there was the economic infeasibility, there were political interests, there was the influence of China, there were the failed engineering studies. But the core theme that we really focused on was the dysfunctional domestic politics that allowed the port to be built despite all these warnings. And so that's what we'll analyze in the next few slides. So as I mentioned before, President Rajapaksa, he had been the visionary behind this port, and he ran for re-election in 2014 in a campaign heavily supported by China, which obviously had financial interests in Port Hambantota. However, given the growing unrest among the general population and the failure of the port thus far, a competitor whose name I will not pronounce won, and he had a platform that was very anti-corruption and anti-China, and he came in wanting to completely halt the Hambantota project in the middle of phase 2.
So despite that effort by the new president to try and halt the project, the agreement that kind of financed phase 2 was binding, so the government was forced to continue with the construction and the port as a whole, which led to the debt for equity swap and the eventual essential ownership of the port by China. And this caused a lot of unrest among people of Hambantota in the local area because they hadn't really been consulted about this port very much. And the fact that this new body was suddenly coming in to take control of this large area and just large influence in the region was pretty concerning.
Yep. There are a lot of other long-term effects of the Hambantota project. Obviously, there's the influence of China. There's a growing realization among Sri Lankans that this is a massive debt trap for the country. And also, as we mentioned, there are possible military and geopolitical motivations down the line. So Sri Lanka has definitely been compromised geopolitically by this project. Also, there are a bunch of effects and threats to the local community. There are threats to the local environment. As you can see here, there's an elephant crossing one of the Chinese-built highways because they were built in a very ecologically sensitive region. There are also lots of threats to agriculture. Hambantota is predominantly an agricultural region. Most of the people there get their living from agriculture, and China's ownership of the 15,000 acres surrounding Port Hambantota has put a lot of those lands in jeopardy. These, again, as Gavin said, these people were not consulted on this deal. Their lands were basically just used as a bargaining chip by the Sri Lankan government. And although most of the lands are still untouched at this point, there's the potential for development in future years. And that would obviously come with a lot of displacement.
Yeah, so as we were thinking about how this could kind of inform us in EWB, we came up with 4 main takeaways. So one of the ones that I think comes to mind first is the desire to build something impressive versus the desire to actually meet the needs of the community that you go into. So as we go forward in our projects, I think it's important that we keep this in mind, because, you know, in Harvard, it's very easy for us to think of like kind of flashy, modern, like high-tech solutions to a lot of the problems that we might see. But it's easy to get sucked into that and not really stay grounded in what the community actually needs, and the really maybe simple solutions that would be best for the community and would be the best use of their funds and our funds. So this, I think, speaks to the importance of the assessment phase too, that when we're going there, we should kind of try and keep an open mind and not try and envision like the perfect thing to do, but just really, you know, gather data and come up with like, you know, a clear picture of what the community actually needs, and then set about trying to find a good way to address that.
Yeah, so going off that, there really is a need for community-driven projects and community involvement at all stages of the process. I mean, if you had asked the people in Hambantota what they wanted as a society, they probably wouldn't have said a port. They probably would have said things like clean drinking water or assistance with farming and things like that. So all these, you know, ambitious plans for a port really did not help the local community. And had they been asked early on in the process, that would have been, you know, known by, you know, the people up top planning the project. Additionally, the Hambantota story stresses the importance of political support for a project. This was a very top-down project. Again, President Rajapaksa was the driving force from the get-go. He had some support at higher levels of government, but once you went down to the general citizens of Sri Lanka, he had very little support for this project, and for his dealings with China. So it's very important to have political support, not only with the local government and community groups we deal with in EWB, but also the people you're talking to in their homes and just the general community. So that's all we have time for. Here's a slide of our references, and feel free to reach out to us on Slack if you have any more questions about this. But hope you enjoyed our presentation.